Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to be painting some magnolias, and this gives us an opportunity to paint some white flowers, but don't get scared, we'll take it step by step. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and grab my Misty stamping platform, and I'm going to put some Arch cold press watercolor paper in. Today we're going to be working with the new Magnolia Wishes from Gina K Designs, and we're going to do this beautiful large floral stamp. So I'm going to place it on my paper how I want it. Pick it up with a lid, and I'll be using some Fade Out ink by Ink on 3. This is my favorite ink for no-line watercolor. It is a very light ink, and I like to keep my pad fairly dry, so I have to stamp it multiple times, which is why I'm using a Misty. At this point, I like to heat set my ink just to make sure that the ink is completely dry before I start painting. I'm going to attach my paper to a painting board to avoid warping while I'm painting. I already have some masking tape on there. I'm just going to press my paper into it. We're going to start by masking out the centers of the flowers using some masking fluid. I'm using the Grumbacher Biscuit, but you can use whatever masking fluid you prefer. To apply it, I'm using a silicone brush. This just has a silicone tip on it. You can use an old paintbrush if you want, but make sure you cover that paintbrush in some soap before applying the masking fluid so you don't ruin the brush completely. For these flowers, I'm using a dabbing motion to apply a thin layer of masking fluid just to the centers of the flowers. I'm not going to cover everything completely. I'm okay leaving a little bit of gappage. I just want to get the basic idea of that center covered in that masking fluid. You do not need to go thick with your masking fluid. The thicker it is, the longer it's going to take to dry. While we wait for the masking fluid to dry completely, let's go over some of the supplies we're going to be using. Obviously, we need some watercolor paints. I will have a list of the colors I used up on the screen. Go ahead and pause it to take a look if you would like, but use whatever colors you have. Next, for the majority of this painting, I'll be using two No. 8 round brushes. The black will always have the paint on it, and the brown will have clean water on it. I also have a porcelain plate off to the side as my mixing palette. I have a rag that I will be drying my brush on when I get too much water on it. I also have a paper towel that I will be blotting my paper with and some water up in this upper corner. So if you see me reaching up there, I'm cleaning off my brush. Alright, let's get started. We're going to start by getting the base layer on the white part of our petals. I'm using Coastal Fog for this, but any light colored, neutral color will work. I'm going to start by adding in some color to the darkest part of my petals. So this is where the shadows will fall, where you have a petal overlapping or where you have a petal curling like I have down here. And you're going to follow the shape of the above item because you're doing the shadow. I'm taking my clean water and I'm just going to soften that color out and fill in the rest of the petal. You can leave some white space if you have the room for it, or you can just bring that color all the way across. Because we are coloring something that is white, we don't want to get too dark too fast. If you get too much color on there, you can dab it up with a paper towel. Right now, our white looks kind of brown and may not look very great, but it will look better as we add the rest of the colors in the image in, because colors are relative. So how you see that white will depend on the other colors around it. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the petals. And I am jumping around, leaving some space between the wet petals. You want to make sure that you're painting next to a dry area or your color is going to bleed. Don't stress too much about getting your form in right now. We are going to add more shadows later, so just get that base layer of color in. The magnolias that we're painting today are the kind that are pink on the underside of the petal with white on the upper side of the petal. So we're only going to color the petals that are on the inside. Any place where the petal is curled over or you see the underside of the petal, that we will color later in pink. Speaking of pink, let's add some pink into the white part of our petals as some reflected color. Now white can be very, very colorful. You just have to make sure you keep it very light. So I'm adding a lot of water to my pink. And then I'm going to take some very, very, very light pink and add it to those shadow areas and then soften it out with my clean brush. Again, you can lift up color with your paper towel if you get too dark. You don't want to completely cover all the white areas in this pink. We're just adding pops of colors here and there just to keep our whites interesting. Don't overthink this and don't stress about it. Just have fun popping in some color. and make sure you keep that color very, very light by making sure there's a lot of water mixed into your paint. You can see here that you can hardly see that I'm even adding color in, but that color will slowly build over time as we add in more layers. At this point, we want our petals to dry completely. Do not use a heat gun because of the masking fluid, just let it air dry. Next, we're going to add in some shadows using our purple color. So I'm going to add in some purple right into the darkest shadow areas and then soften that out with that clean brush. Now keep in mind that shadows can be quite dark even on white areas. You want some shadows that are lighter and some that are darker for contrast. Look around with the other petals around to see where you need darker color in order to define that shape from the other petals around it. This is something that takes a little bit of practice, and I will often stop and kind of step back and look at it to see what petals need a little bit more definition. I think it's at this point that this flower really hits its ugly stage, and that is very common in paintings. They often hit an ugly stage, but don't stop, keep going, it gets better, I promise. At this point, our flowers are looking very cool because of all the purple in there, and I want to have a little bit more sunshine. So I'm going to add in a very, very watered down yellow to some of the petals, opposite of the darkest shadows. Imagine the sun is in the upper right-hand corner, and think about where that sunlight is going to come and hit the petals from there. As I'm doing that, I can see where some of my shadows need to be a little bit darker, so I'll go ahead and add in some more purple and let the petals dry completely. When the white areas are dry, we can go ahead and add in our pink on the under part of the petals. Now, I didn't like how bright this pink was, so on my palette I mixed a little bit of that purple in with the pink just to tone it down a little bit. If your white is not completely dry, the pink will bleed into it, like it did for me, but it's okay. You just lift that up with a paper towel and it's fine, don't panic. So I'm going to go ahead and do same thing I did with the white areas by adding in that darker color, then softening it out with the clean water. I'm going to put that on all of the undersides of the petals, and because I can't help myself, I am occasionally adding in some darker shadows where my shadows are just completely lost. Remember, I said earlier that color is relative, and what looks like a really dark shadow may not look so dark when you have some dark pink in there. So you may need to go back and darken up some of those shadows as we're going. Now, I made a rookie mistake, and I didn't mix enough of my purple-pink mixture when I first mixed it up, and so I had to make another batch. And as you can see, it's not quite the same as my first color. And I actually like this one better. It's a little bit brighter, a little bit darker, and so I end up sticking with it. But this is why when you mix colors, you want to make sure you mix enough for your whole painting, because it's really hard to get your mix exactly perfect if you have to mix a second batch in the middle. Alright, so I'm adding some pink to all of my buds, and again, I'm skipping around, making sure that where I'm painting, the areas around it are dry so I don't get that color bleed or lose the definition between the petals. Don't worry, I will add that darker pink to that first flower so it matches. Watercolors can also have a bit of a drying shift and dry lighter than they went on. So if an area dries lighter than you want it to be, go ahead and add a second layer of color. Once our pink is dry, we need to add in our shadows. We're going to use that same purple that we used in our white as our shadows for the pink, but you can go quite a bit darker in the pink areas. So I'm going to add in the darkest area and then soften it out with some clean water. And like always, I'm noticing areas in my white that have now gotten a lot lighter in comparison to the areas around it and need some darker shadows. So I'm going to add those in too. If you want to add a little bit of shape to some of the flatter petals that don't have any curls, you can add a C shape near the edge of the petal and then soften one side of that with clean water, and that will give you a cupped petal. Now that we have some of our darker colors in place, we can be a little bit bolder with the colors that we are putting into our white. So I'm going to add a little bit of that pink-purple mixture, very watered down, to some of the petals in various places, really focusing on the shadow areas and bringing that color into the shadows. If it starts getting too dark, you can always soften that color with a paper towel. I like a lot of color in my white areas, so we're going to add more sunshine in. I'm taking that really watered down yellow and brushing it in on various places. I'm not trying to cover everything in the yellow, I'm just adding it into various places on the white and the pink, and keeping in mind where that sunshine is going to hit it. I love the extra bit of warmth that this gives the flowers. It's like looking at flowers on a sunny day. After you get your yellow in, go ahead and let your flowers dry completely. Then we'll move on to the stem and the leaves. For the stem, I'm going to be using a mixture of green and brown. We're starting our stem with our brown color. We're going to put the darkest color in the shadow areas and then pull that color out with the clean water, just like we did for the petals. We want to work fairly quickly to get all of our stems in, because we want to work wet and wet to add the green in a minute. I'm just popping all of those stems in really quickly, not overthinking it. And now, while the paper is still wet, we're going to add some green in. Again, darkest color up in the shadows and then soften it out. Try not to overwork the area, just very quick brush strokes. And I'm going to get green all over the place. I'm going to pick that up with a paper towel. All right. Now we're going to tap in a little bit more brown, and I'm just dotting it in a few areas. I'm letting my brush just dance. I'm not going to blend this. I'm going to let the water do the blending. And that's all we're going to do for that branch. We're going to let it dry and let the water do its magic. Moving on to our leaves, I like to use two colors on my leaves. I will use the green and also the pink from the flowers. To add that pink, I'm going to grab another brush, just a small brush, and that tiny brush will have my pink on it. I'm going to add in my green to the darkest areas, the shadow areas, pull the color out with the clean water. I do like to add more color into the leaf than I did the petals. And then while it is still wet, I am just going to dot in a couple of areas of pink and then let the water do the mixing for me. Don't scrub it around, just dot in the color and let the water move the paint. This will give you very beautiful color variations on your leaves, make your leaves more interesting. It will also help tie your leaves into your flowers with some reflected color. After I paint the leaves, I'm going to let them dry completely. Then I'm going to take my very small brush and add in just the hint of that center vein in each of the leaves. I'm also going to paint in the leaf that I forgot to paint earlier. When you're done with that, give it a minute to dry, and then we can move on to our shadows. We're going to use that same purple that we've been using throughout the entire painting. And the green can handle a fairly dark shadow. So we'll drop in a dark shadow in those areas where there may be some overlapping petals, casting a shadow, and then we'll soften those shadows out with some clean water. Having added our dark green in there, now is a great time to step back and see if there's any areas that need a little bit more color or more shadow to give some definition. Don't be afraid to get some darker shadows in some of those areas on your white petals. Not all of your shadows need to be super dark, but contrast gives it a lot of dimension. We also need to add some sunlight with our yellow to our leaves, as well as some of the petals if they need it. I like a lot of color on my whites, so I'm going to add more sunshine there. Soften that out with some clean water. And then we just set this aside to dry completely before we move on to the next step. When your paper is 100% dry, you can take an adhesive eraser like this to gently scrub away the masking fluid. Now it should just come up really easily. You do need to have quality paper and a good masking fluid for this to work. If your paper is tearing, you may need to try a different masking fluid or a different paper. For the flower centers, I'm going to start by dotting in some yellow. I'm leaving some white spaces. I'm just dotting that in, then blotting that off with a paper towel, and while it's still wet, adding in some brown. Again, I'm doing that stippling motion and I'm leaving some white areas. And then gently blot. You can leave your background white, but I like to add a little bit of color. One way to add color is by splattering. To do this, you want to get a very wet puddle of paint on your palette, pick that up with a brush, and then hit one brush against the other, and this will create a speckle pattern. If you want to be a little bit braver, you can use a very light watery wash to add in some random brush strokes throughout your background to add in some color. I'm not trying to color everything, I'm just adding some pops of color here and there. Some areas will be a little bit darker, some will be a little bit lighter. I don't want an even color, just some pops. I'm also going to add in just a tiny bit of green in a few areas just to pull in that leaf color. Now I'm keeping this very light and very subtle. This just gives it a little bit of something in the background. And I'm going to add some splatters on top of that because I like splatters. You can dab up any stray splatters with a paper towel. Going back to the centers of our flowers, now that they're dry, I'm going to add in a little bit of shadow with that brown color, doing that speckling motion. So I'll keep the dark color on one side and let the lighter color be on the other side. Final looks for adding in darker shadows and a little bit more color wherever it is needed. Because these watercolors are transparent, you're going to see all these different layers of color that we've been building up on our whites, and it leaves them looking very beautiful and interesting. At this point, I'm going to remove my paper from my board, and it's ready to turn into a card front. Painting white flowers in watercolor can be tricky and can take some practice, but I hope this video helped it feel more approachable. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And make sure that you're following me if you want to see more watercolor videos. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those in the comments and I will get back to you as soon as I can. I hope you have a wonderful day.